Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 16th of March of 2025. Today we have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to discuss once again the Suja offensive operation and the consequences of this operation. You know that the Russians they managed to carry out that pipeline offensive special operation when they landed behind the main positions of the armored forces of Ukraine, that in the end led to complete collapse of Ukrainian lines and so on. And obviously now, as for me, I don't know what do you think about this, but if you ask my opinion, now I clearly and strongly understand that was very lucky operation. First of all, and obviously that day on the 8th of March of 2025, when the Russians landed in this area, obviously the luck was on their side. Obviously, because it was too dangerous, and it was a very big luck that the Russians, those soldiers, managed to come out from that pipeline and safe, that they managed to survive during those 4 days in pipeline. Anything might happen. Anything might happen, including, let's say, the traitors, that somebody could provide this information to the Ukrainians and they basically could destroy those pipelines without any problems. Furthermore, the luck was on the Russian side when they came out of that pipeline, and the Ukrainians didn't discover them immediately. The Russians had several hours to establish complete control over the settlement of Mirny, to take positions along the railways, and many other things. Which means that that operation for the Russians was plan A. So that was a plan A, and everything, of course, depended on that plan A. And we see that the Russians managed to complete plan A, so that's why they didn't have to use plan B. So what was the plan B? And the plan B was very simple. The thing is that the Russians, before the beginning of that offensive operation, they answered themselves one important question: whether they're going to restore control over the Suja direction at any cost, at any price. And the answer was yes. The Russians were planning to restore control over the entire Suja direction at any cost, no matter how many losses they will suffer as a result of offensive operation. And that was plan B. So if plan A went wrong, the Russians would begin plan B, and plan B means the beginning of offensive operation with a significant number of forces, units, soldiers, helicopters, aircrafts, with everything they had. And the Russians probably had 4 times more forces around the territory of Suja in comparison with the Ukrainian side. But now there is another important question then: where the Russians took those forces, because obviously those forces appeared not from anything, from the shadow or from the sand. Those were real soldiers that the Russians were forced to redeploy in this direction, probably from the entire line of combat contact. And you know that before the beginning of the last and final offensive operation in the Suja direction, we mentioned and we noted that the Russians stopped any activities in the vicinity of Velika Novosovka. Indeed, after the fall of this village, the Russians stopped. Yes, they managed to improve their positions a bit, but we believe that those attacks that were carried out in the vicinity of Novoselka, Privilna, Burlatskaya, the main purpose of those attacks were just to distract Ukrainian attention and to show them that indeed we continue our offensive operation here with the Russians. So that's why nobody was redeployed. But the main purpose of those attacks were to force Ukrainians to keep reserves in this area. That's it. Anyway, for example, when talking about Bogatyr direction, after the fall of Ulakli, the Russians also stopped. There have been no movements since the beginning probably of March, which means that probably most of the forces from these territories, or some forces or reserves from this territory, were also redeployed in the direction of Suja. The Russians stopped completely their movements in the direction of the border between the Donetsk region and the region of Dnipro, which also means that the Russians decided to slow down, because they wasn't sure for 100% if they continue offensive operation. They are able to take border under control, and they weren't sure that if Ukrainians would counterattack, if the Ukrainians counterattack, they would be able to repel. So that's why the Russians decided to hold positions they managed to capture by the, let's say, by the beginning of March. The same story we used to see in the Pokrovsk direction. You know that when the Russians were preparing those Plan A and Plan B of their offensive operation in Suja, they redeployed a significant number of units and forces from this area as well in the Suja direction. And this is the main reason why the Russians stopped. The Russians, by the end, or somewhere by the middle of February, managed to take under control the southwestern part of Udachne, the settlement of Kotlina, Pishane, Shevchenka, Uspenovka, and then they stopped. And of course, the Ukrainians noted that the Russians stopped, and starting from the mid-February, the Ukrainians carry out lots of counterattacks with the purpose to restore control over these villages. And you know that at some point, the Ukrainians managed to restore control over Shevchenka, Pishane, Kotlina, Udachne, and many other settlements. But now, by the way, I would like to point your attention that now the Ukrainians also stopped and they're not moving anymore because they understand that they have currently problems. The Russians stopped their offensive operation in the city of Toretsk. Furthermore, when talking about the settlement of Toretsk, the Russians not just stopped their offensive operation because they were forced to fall back, they were forced to redeploy some forces from this area in the direction of Suja. Furthermore, the Ukrainians managed to regroup, and the Ukrainians managed to counterattack the Russians and to restore up to 20 or even 30% of the city of Toretsk. As for the end of the 16th of March, the Russians managed to stabilize the situation, and now they're trying to find a solution how to force the Ukrainians to fall back from the regained territories. So as you can see, it's like one first direction, the second direction, third direction, fourth. We have discussed 5 directions, and on every single direction, the Russians stopped probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, probably at the time when the Russians began final preparation of the Suja offensive. Furthermore, the Russians stopped their offensive operation in the city of Chasiv Yar. Yes, they managed to improve their positions a bit. The Russians managed to take several positions. The Russians managed to force the Ukrainians to fall back. But we see that it's like the situation when the Russians managed to complete something by 50% and for some reason they stopped. And the only reason why the Russians stopped their offensive in Chasiv Yar is the redeployment of their forces from this area to Suja as well. The same story we could see in the northern Kupiansk direction. The Russians during December, January, and the first half of February managed to improve their position significantly on the Ukrainian side of the river Voskol. Lots of villages were taken, Zapadne, Dvorichne, lots of fields, fortifications were captured by the Russians, and many other things. But then the Russians stopped, and it was turned when the Ukrainians began their own counterattacks. And as a result of Ukraine counterattacks, they managed to restore up to 20 or even 30% of the territories captured by the Russians. And now we understand that Plan B for the Russians was anyway to take under control the city of Suja and to remove this trump card from Zelensky's hands. But the main problem for the Ukrainians is that Plan A worked out. This was the biggest success of the armed forces of the Russian Federation since the beginning of the special military operation. The thing is that due to the fact that the Plan A, let's say, worked for the Russians, this means that the Russians managed to save significant number of soldiers. And when talking about the Ukrainians, during the retreat process, during the process when the Ukrainians were withdrawing their positions, the Ukrainians suffered significant losses. I can't tell you the exact ratio, but I wouldn't be surprised if the ratio of losses between the Russians and the Ukrainians during the Battle of Suja would be around 1 to 10. One Russian soldier, for example, in exchange for 10 Ukrainian soldiers. Because the Russians were advancing, we see lots of trophies, we see lots of abandoned vehicles that completely undamaged by the, let's say, by the consequences of war. The Russians will use these vehicles in the future, either on the line of combat contact, or they will send them to some engineering factories where the engineers of the Russian Federation will find, let's say, solutions how to improve Russian weapons. Anyway, we see that the Russians managed to save their potential. their military potential. And now, what does it mean for the current situation, for the reality? This means that the Russians now can use this potential, this gap that's the Russian established on some other direction. And now the Russian commanders like Valery Gerasimov, like Putin himself, and generals along the entire line of combat contacts are thinking where they can use this potential. And of course, the Russians can return back these forces, every single brigade, to every single direction. Those who were in the area of Chasiv Yar, to return them to the Chasiv Yar. Those who were in the vicinity of Toretsk, to return them back to Toretsk. Those who were on the territory or along the river of Oskol, to return them to the river of Oskol. But on the other hand, on the other side, the Russians can use all these forces all together and, let's say, to deploy them somewhere in the Zaporozhye direction, and to use this attack phase just at one position, let's say in the vicinity of the city of Chasiv Yar. The Russians can do whatever they like, and this is the biggest problems for the Ukrainians, because they also try to understand where exactly the Russians are going to use these forces. And you know that currently there are lots of talks and lots of rumors, and the Russians at the end of the offensive operation in Suja began playing with the Ukrainians, trying to distract their attention and trying to force them that probably the Russian next main strike is going to take place in the Sumy direction. The Russians, after they are able to take under control the border, will continue moving further in the direction of the settlement by the name of Yunakivka. Do the Russians can do this? Of course they can do this. Of course they can do this, and at least the Russians want the Ukrainians to think like that. Also, the Ukrainians, as you know, recently have begun their activities in the northern Kupiansk direction, and you know that today we got a lot of very interesting updates published by both pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian sources, and according to them, the Russians managed to cross the river of Oskol at two additional points. One of the area where the Russians crossed the river is the southeastern part of the city of Kamenka itself. So the Russians crossed the river somewhere here, and according to different mappers like pro-Russian, they managed to dig in deeper and to take several positions on the outskirts of this small settlement. Furthermore, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians crossed the river of Oskol in the area of the village of Petrikovka, and now we see that the Russians are trying to advance to the road between the settlement of Petroivanovka and Kamenka itself with the purpose to cut supplies. So the Russians intensified their activities in this area with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to think that maybe the Russians are planning to carry out their major offensive and their main strike exactly in this area, because you know that there are lots of things that the Russians are able to do here. First of all, if the Russians continue attacking this way, sooner or later they will be able to establish complete control over the territories between the city of Kupiansk itself, the Russian border, the city of Volchansk itself, and of course the Pechenegi water reservoir. So all these territories could be taken by the Russians with the forces they managed to save during the battle for the city of Suja, and they can be redeployed easily in this area in the very short period of time, and they continue offensive. And if this direction collapses, nobody knows how exactly the Ukrainians are planning to stabilize the situation. Furthermore, the Russians can carry out their major offensive and their main strike somewhere in the Liman direction. For example, according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in this area, and as for this territory, the main benefit of this direction for the Russians is that there are almost no trenches. The Ukrainians, for some reason, since the beginning of the special military operation, or since the beginning when they managed to restore control over this territory during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, didn't invest money and didn't invest resources to prepare trenches and the fortifications in this area. The Ukrainians built just two defense lines, and we can see them on this screen, but as you can see, and as for the end of the 16th of March, the Russians have already established up to 35% of these trenches and this dense network of the fortifications. A few more kilometers in the northwestern direction and the entire defense line would be taken by the Russians, which can lead to completely unpredictable consequences for the armed force of Ukraine. And this small part could be cut in several pieces as well, which the Russians will handle with every single one separately, and the third battle for Liman will start. Furthermore, the Russians can redeploy their forces in the Sivers direction, because this is the biggest pain of the armed force of the Russian Federation since the beginning of the special military operation, when the Russians managed to take under control the city of Lysychansk, but then the Russians slowed down completely. But now we see that due to the heavy losses and difficult situation in this area, the Russians during the late 2024 and early 2025 managed to improve their position significantly. The Russians captured the highest elevation in this area, Bila Gora. The Russians managed to answer the settlement of Verkhnykamenska and to take under strong control the eastern part. And of course, the most important, this village of Bilagorovka is already behind the Russians. So the Russians can send forces here. And furthermore, if you remember, several days ago, we were talking about Vasyukovka offensive operation, and the Russians managed to cut this territory in two, and maybe by the end of the 16th of March, the village was completely secured. We just haven't received anything that can confirm this, but obviously the Russians were doing to finish this. So the Russians can send their attack fist here, and the main offensive can take place somewhere in the area of the city of Siversk. The city of Chesavyar, the same story. The Russians almost finished the battle for the settlement. Up to 50% were taken by the Russians before the beginning of the Suja offensive, and several more brigades that the Russians can deploy here from the Kursk direction can break the situation completely. And in the very near future, within the next several weeks, the Ukrainians can meet the first Russian group somewhere on the outskirts of Konstantinovka, which can be another media victory of the Russians and complete defeat of the Ukrainian authorities. Another important thing that I would like to point to attention, that several days ago we got a very interesting statement made by the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation that as a result of offensive, the Russians managed to cross the Seversky Donetsk Canal and to establish complete control over Novomarkovo. And now we see that from these territories we start receiving lots of updates. Maybe the Russians now have plans to create much stronger positions on the Russian side of Seversky Donetsk Donbas Canal, and you know that the Russians have enough of forces to take territories like this under complete control. We're talking about the settlement of Markovo, Novomarkovo, and the village of Maisky. And from these positions, the Russians can attack in any direction, because the distance to the heart of the Donbas arc operation, the settlement of Kramatorsk, Dushkovka, would be minimal since the beginning of the special military operation. And from these positions, the Russians can easily cut this territory in many pieces and then to handle with every single one separately. And obviously this is the direction, despite the significant number of trenches and the fortifications, this is the direction that the Ukrainians don't expect that the Russians can dare to attack. So anything might happen. The city of Terezk, yes, the Russians were forced to fall back during the previous weeks because they weakened their positions due to the situation in Suja area, but now the Russians can start everything from the beginning. Now the Russians can return the main forces in this area and to force the Ukrainians to fall back and to begin offensive further in the city of Konstantinovka. Everything is happened. The city of Pokrovsk, the same story. The Russians can return back their units in this area and to continue offensive towards the Dnipro region, or with the purpose to outflank the city of Pokrovsk from the west and from the northwest, with the purpose to cut the settlement from supply and support, and then to take this big city under complete control, which can lead also to complete collapse. You know that now the Russians are in the situation when they can make a major offensive, major blow that can lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian lines. And then the Western countries, including the United Kingdom and France, would be forced to introduce their forces on the ground. For example, we continue receiving different updates from France and the United Kingdom that we can read from all these articles that maybe their intelligence have information that Ukrainians most likely will not be able to hold lines, and sooner or later they would be forced to start acting. So that's why they have already begun the preparation of their societies to this probably unpopular decision. For example, European countries that agreed to send a military contingent to Ukraine, allegedly for an observation mission, can do so without Russia's consent, French President Emmanuel Macron said in an interview with Le Parisien. Ukraine is a sovereign country if it asks for allied troops to be present on its territory, it's not up to Russia to decide whether to agree or not, he said. So we believe that this is something like a plan B for the United Kingdom and Ukraine. As soon as they see that Ukraine collapses, as soon as they see that the Russians are about to break through significantly and to take huge part of Ukraine under control, most likely Zelensky, as a plan B or even as a plan C, will ask Europeans to deploy their contingent, which will allow the European countries and Ukraine to win some time. Obviously, the United States of America will not be involved in this situation. Currently, they have a lot of things and lots of problems in the Middle East. So that's why Europeans will be forced to fight the Russians themselves. So one-on-one, and nobody will help them. Anyway, let's wait and see, of course, what is going to be next. But, of course, the Russians also continue advancing in the South Donetsk direction to attack further in the direction of the settlement of Gulay Polye. As for now, there are no activities here completely. Furthermore, don't forget that the Russians began something in the Zaporozhye direction. As for the end of the 16th of March, we still haven't received even a single video that can confirm additional progress of the armored forces on the ground. So we haven't received anything, despite lots of reports from soldiers, from neutral, from pro-Ukrainian, from pro-Russian sources. But it doesn't mean that there is no progress. That means that maybe the Russians are trying to keep everything in secret. So who knows what is going to be next, but let's say by the end of the 16th of March, the Russians, according to different sources, managed to establish complete control over these territories we are coloring right now in red color. So, and what is this? It's very difficult to understand. Maybe the Russians are preparing themselves before possible Ukraine counterattack in this area with the purpose to establish control over the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, or maybe the Russians began their offensive towards the city of Zaporozhye, or at least with the purpose to cut the settlement of Orekha from supply and support by establishing control over NO8 road. Nobody knows for sure, but once again, the Russians can deploy their forces from Suja in any place, and this will allow the Russians to get let's say benefits and to gain superiority and complete advantage on any of the direction and to resolve the situation very fast. You know that the Battle of Suja ended very fast, and this is probably the best thing that the Russians managed to achieve, because when talking, for example, any other direction, the slower you're moving, the more chances for the opposite side to prepare themselves for further advances and for redeployment towards more reliable positions. So here we can see the same story. If the Russians are able to redeploy huge amount of forces, let's say 30, 40, 50,000 soldiers, completely invisible, completely, let's say, secret from Ukrainian side to any of these directions we've just discussed, and to begin fast lightning attack, this can lead to the same results that the Russians managed to achieve in the Suja direction. But if the Russians want to get something like this and to repeat the success of Suja offensive, of course they need to have a deal with the United States of America, which means that they need to find a solution how to force the United States of America to stop providing the Ukrainians with to stop sharing with Ukrainians with intelligence information. Because another important thing that I strongly believe that's probably the Russians managed to achieve the results, such results in the Suja offensive operation, thanks to or because of, I don't know how to what kind of words is better to use, because of fact that US during the same period of time stopped sharing with Ukrainians with intelligence information. So that was probably one of the reasons why the Russians managed to carry out that operation secretly. So if the Russians are able to repeat this, so we may see another Suja, but somewhere else. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you, we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel. Put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.